Yo, how's it going everybody? It's Sketch and welcome back to the channel. And on today's episode, we're taking a look at The Suffering, developed by Surreal Software and published by Midway for the PS2, original Xbox, and PC in 2004. This hybrid first and third person shooter is quite an interesting game that deals with some rather heavy and at times grotesque subject matter, while having a challenging game in tow that's a solid blend of action and horror. The Suffering is one of those games I tried back when it released and didn't get too far into it considering it was a rental, and just managed to get stuck on sections only to never finish it until recently. All things aside, this is a good one to circle back to, but before we get too far ahead, let's check out the story. As you enter death row in Abbott State Penitentiary, you play the role of silent protagonist Torque, who is here after the alleged murder of his family, which he has no memory of committing. Not long after his arrival, the coast of Maryland is hit by an earthquake which releases an unusual seismic energy, allowing supernatural to walk amongst the living. As you make your way to freedom, you'll battle your inner demons while trying to figure out what actually happened to your family through the game's 19 stages. Gameplay-wise, you can switch between either a first or third person perspective on this descent into madness as you escape from Abbott State and make your way up along the coastline in search of answers and resolution. In first person mode, you can wield a heavy arsenal of weapons, starting out with a shiv at first and then working up to magnums, shotguns, and Tommy guns, just to name a few. Several of these weapons can be dual wielded, making you even more of a formidable foe against the legions of malefactors who have overrun the prison grounds, killing any and everything in sight. In third person, same rules apply, except you have a wider range of vision, along with being able to use a dodge mechanic, which can get you out of some pretty sticky situations with the swarms of enemies you'll be up against. Early on in the game, you'll be able to transform into a hulking behemoth, allowing you to chain massive melee combos together and make literal mincemeat of your enemies. Only catch is, if you stay in this mode too long, it'll take away your health and eventually kill you, so keeping an eye on that insanity meter is a must. Aside from the action-driven vibe this game goes for, it also throws in a lot of psychological horror, especially as you meet other inmates and officers about the prison grounds. The morality system also comes into play here, considering depending on actions taken in-game will affect the ending in a few ways. If you choose to help those you meet, you'll lean more towards the good side, and if you just murk everybody, then I think you can fill in the rest. You can also just completely ignore NPCs if you want to, so there's a few ways to go about these sections, of which there are several. There's a decent bit of platforming scene here too throughout the campaign, and a fair bit to explore on the prison grounds and the coast as you make your way out. You even see a few puzzles here along the way, like the projectors in the asylum, and the searchlights that can torch enemies in a similar fashion to Alan Wake, which is pretty sick. The Suffering is also another game where there is no auto healing or regeneration, but there are bottles of pills scattered around the facility, so if you're taking a lot of damage, try to keep an eye out for painkillers. The normal setting is pretty generous with them, so you shouldn't run out of them except for possibly towards the ending sections of the game. Graphics wise, this is a pretty dark game as far as its atmosphere and the enemies you'll face. The Suffering's development team wanted to go for a horror title that subverts the standards seen in other games of the genre like Resident Evil and Silent Hill, and move with a more action-driven approach. They used a free-roaming camera in third person along with a first-person perspective, which differed from the static cameras most other horror games were familiar with at the time. Several enemy designs were conceived by Stan Winston, who also was responsible for numerous horror movie creations like the Queen Alien from the Aliens franchise, the T-800 from the Terminator franchise, and even some of the dinosaurs seen in Jurassic Park. The characters drafted for The Suffering all represent the grim realities of incarceration, mainly centered around forms of execution. In turn, there's some pretty gnarly enemies seen throughout the game, especially leading up to the game's final encounter that has a behemoth that towers above you. Level designs are also pretty varied, going through several sections of the Abbott prison and a few outdoor sections along the northeastern coastline. The levels and the vibe of the game have a feel of The Shining, which developers note as a major influence, along with the at times grindhouse vibe that is also very pronounced. When characters like Dr. Killjoy get introduced, the game definitely goes into some wild territory and it looks pretty sick. Visual effects here are also pretty solid, and there's a good bit of lighting effects seen also. The flashlight you carry in tow utilizes some cool dynamic lighting tricks, illuminating the horrific scenery around you. There's no shortage of blood and viscera strewn about each area, and kill animations can be pretty intense. The shotgun in particular often rips enemies to shreds in glorious fashion. And as you play through the game's 19 stages, there's also a lot of flashbacks and hallucinations that unravel more of the story and how you got to this point, and these bits can be pretty heavy, though these parts are visually striking more often than not. Being able to freely move back and forth between first and third person is also pretty smooth, and the only real downside is that some of the abilities don't always transfer. For example, the dodge mechanic doesn't really work as well in first person as it does in third. Though playing through the game mainly in first person, you'll still be able to clear the game without it, but if you want to maximize agility as well as screen real estate, switching cameras might be the best option. Sound-wise also is pretty interesting with its sound effects and accompanying soundtrack, which is mainly composed of objects found in the environment. This makes for some drony, atmospheric ambient tunes, while at times having an industrial feel about it. Radio chatter and the sounds of intercom interference also casually hum in the background alongside the roar of the fire, and so the music and sound effects here are honestly killing it. There's also a lot of voice acting heard throughout the game's campaign, and this also sounds good and is also delivered fairly well. This was where the feel of The Shining coupled with the delivery of gory grindhouse film really came to the forefront, with its performance performances and dialogue that feel very familiar. If you're a horror fan in general, you'll notice the tropes you know, but with a few twists which are unique to it. Gunfire and explosion sounds are also pretty good and balanced across the accompanying audio tracks. As far as in-game sound, nothing really overpowers the other at any point really, so even when things get hectic on screen, the audio is always balanced, allowing you to keep up with what's going on action and narrative-wise, which is a nice attention to detail and function. Overall, The Suffering is an underrated horror-themed shooter considering what this game pulls off technically, and how it goes about its honestly brutal subject matter is a solid game. It's got a fine blend of action coupled with some truly gripping cerebral horror that at times will leave you guessing as to what the lead character's motives truly are. The morality system along with the insanity meter allowing you to unleash your inner evil on a whim is also a nice feature on top of already solid shooting mechanics. There's some gnarly content and imagery contained within, so this one might not be for the squeamish, but for those into horror, especially the likes of early Stephen King or Clive Barker, this one might be something to look into along with its sequel, which we'll look at sometime in the future. The Suffering gets an 8 out of 10 and comes recommended for horror and shooter fans, since this strikes a good blend of both while serving up challenging gameplay with a decent, albeit dark narrative. The platforming and puzzles might throw some off momentarily, but once you figure it out, you'll be right back on track. It's also on the more lengthy end of about 7 to 10 hours, and the further along it gets, the more twists the game throws in. So it's a worthwhile play for those into this type of game for sure. The Xbox and PS2 versions are slowly creeping up in price, but are still on the cheaper end, so this one is a solid pickup for those willing to dive into the darker end of the third and first person shooters. And I thank you again for checking out this video if you made it this far, and if you find these videos helpful, that's awesome. I'm glad you can use it as a resource. Check back often, we'll have more reviews and commentaries coming up in the near future, but until then, take it easy and stay safe out there. I'll see you on the next one.